It was a bitterly cold Thanksgiving night, and the moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the desolate road. Marissa had volunteered to host her family's Thanksgiving dinner at her new home this year, a historic house she'd recently purchased in a rural New England town. The home was beautiful but weathered, creaking with the weight of decades, its history whispered through uneven floorboards and peeling wallpaper. The day had been lively, full of laughter, clinking glasses, and the comforting aroma of roasted turkey. But as the evening deepened and the family left, a heavy silence settled over the house. Marissa, exhausted, decided to leave the cleanup for the morning. She extinguished the last of the candles, the only light source in the room now that the storm outside had knocked out the power. With her phone battery dwindling, she relied on a single flashlight to guide her up the narrow staircase. The house seemed unnaturally quiet as she climbed. She passed the old family portraits left behind by the previous owners, their eyes glinting eerily in the dim light. At the top of the stairs, a peculiar sound caught her attention. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps pacing slowly back and forth. It seemed to echo from the attic. Marissa froze, her pulse quickening. She rationalized that it must be the wind, but deep down she felt the unease crawling beneath her skin. She told herself she'd check it out tomorrow and retreated to her bedroom. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was unmistakably human. A slow, deliberate dragging sound that seemed to scrape against the attic floorboards directly above her. She gripped her flashlight tightly, her breath shallow, trying to will herself to move. Then came the whispering. A low, unintelligible murmur that sent shivers racing down her spine. Unable to bear it any longer, Marissa grabbed the closest thing she could find, a heavy brass candlestick, and crept toward the attic stairs. She tried to ignore the oppressive weight of the darkened house and the growing sense that she was being watched. Each creak of the steps beneath her feet felt deafening in the silence. When she reached the attic door, she paused. The whispers had stopped. The air was so still it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Gathering every ounce of courage, she pushed open the door. The beam of her flashlight swept across the attic, revealing nothing but cobwebbed furniture and old trunks. She exhaled shakily, feeling foolish for scaring herself. But as she turned to leave, the flashlight flickered and died. Panic surged through her as she fumbled to tap it back on. In the pitch black, she became acutely aware of a presence, a cold, suffocating pressure that seemed to loom closer. Then she heard it, the sound of breathing, slow and rasping, just behind her. Marissa spun around, swinging the candlestick wildly into the void, but it hit nothing. Suddenly, she felt hands, icy and claw-like, grip her shoulders. A guttural voice growled in her ear, "Why did you disturb us?" She screamed, breaking free and stumbling toward the stairs. As she descended, she tripped and fell hard, her vision blurring as she hit the floor. When she came to, dawn was breaking through the windows. She was lying at the base of the attic stairs, the candlestick still clutched in her hand. The house was silent once more, almost serene. Convinced it had been a nightmare, she rose unsteadily and went to the kitchen for water. There, in the daylight, she froze. The table was set again, though she was sure she'd left it a mess. Plates of food sat steaming as if freshly served. But the chairs were wrong, pulled out and facing away from the table, all angled toward the kitchen door. Marissa backed away, her heart hammering, when she caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye. In the reflection of the glass oven door, she saw them. Shadowy figures stood behind her, their hollow eyes staring, faces contorted in anger. And then, one by one, they smiled. It was Christmas Eve, and a blizzard had swallowed the small mountain town where Claire lived. The snow piled high against her windows, muffling the world outside and leaving her in a cocoon of eerie silence. Her family was supposed to arrive for the holidays, but the storm had canceled all travel plans, leaving her alone in the old cabin. She consoled herself with hot cocoa and the warm glow of the fireplace, trying to embrace the quiet as a rare moment of peace. The cabin, however, had its own history. Built in the 1800s, it had been passed down through generations of her family, and stories of its haunted past had always been shared as a source of amusement. Claire had dismissed them as tales meant to spook the younger kids, but tonight, with the storm raging outside, The stories felt heavier, closer. She decided to turn in early, taking a candle with her since the power had flickered out hours before. As she climbed the creaking staircase, she heard it. A faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. It seemed to come from somewhere above her, but the cabin had no attic, only the roof, now buried beneath layers of snow. Dismissing it as the wind, she continued to her bedroom and locked the door behind her, as much out of habit as comfort. She fell asleep quickly, but was startled awake by the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was part of a dream, but the sound persisted. Slow, shuffling steps moving down the hallway outside her room. Her heart pounded as she strained to listen, the candle on her bedside table flickering with each shallow breath. She told herself it was nothing, maybe even a raccoon trapped in the walls, but the sound grew louder. Then came a soft, deliberate knock at her door. Claire froze. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she stared at the door, willing herself not to respond. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Summoning every ounce of courage, she whispered, "Who's there?" The answer came in a low, distorted voice that didn't belong to anyone she knew. "Let me in." Panic seized her. She grabbed her phone, but it was dead, the battery drained without explanation. She backed against the far wall, her eyes locked on the door. The knob began to turn slowly, the old mechanism clicking ominously. It shouldn't have been possible. The door was locked. But as the knob twisted and the door creaked open, she realized the lock had been useless. There was nothing there. Only the hallway, stretching dark and empty. Claire felt a brief wave of relief, but it was short-lived. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath now visible in the dim light of the candle. And then she saw them, handprints pressed against the frosted window. They were on the inside. Claire's scream caught in her throat as she turned to see the figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by a tattered hood. When it moved, its joints cracked and popped as if unused to motion. It tilted its head toward her, and though its face remained hidden, she felt its gaze boring into her. It raised a hand, long fingers curling into a point. "You've invited me," it said in that same guttural voice. "Now, I'll stay." Claire bolted for the door, but as she did, the figure was suddenly there, blocking her way. Its face was now visible, a pale, hollow visage with empty black sockets where eyes should have been. She stumbled back, falling onto the bed, and as she did, the figure reached for her. And then she woke up. Or so she thought. The candle was still burning on her bedside table. The room was quiet, the storm outside reduced to a gentle howl. She let out a shuddering breath, telling herself it had all been a nightmare. But when she glanced at the window, the handprints were still there, and beneath them, scratched into the frost, were the words, "Welcome home." The night was suffocatingly still, as if the world itself had paused. Mia had taken the job as an overnight caretaker for the old Wilcox Asylum to make some quick cash, but as the clock struck midnight, she began questioning her decision. The building had been abandoned for decades, its halls echoing with rumors of experiments gone wrong and patients who had never truly left. Armed with a flashlight and a walkie-talkie that crackled with static, Mia began her first round of the facility. The asylum was a labyrinth of crumbling walls and peeling paint, the air thick with mildew and a faint metallic tang she couldn't place. Her footsteps echoed too loudly, and she found herself walking faster, trying to outrun the oppressive weight of the silence. She turned down a long corridor lined with empty patient rooms. The doors hung on rusted hinges, some ajar, others sealed shut. As she swept her flashlight across the floor, she noticed faint, wet footprints leading away from her. They glistened under the beam as if freshly made. Mia stopped cold, her breath hitching. She was alone, wasn't she? The footprints turned into one of the rooms. Summoning her courage, Mia followed them, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for an old wheelchair positioned in the center, its wheels facing her as if it had been waiting. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief darkness, she heard the unmistakable creak of the wheelchair moving. When the light steadied, the chair was inches closer, the wheels still spinning as if something had pushed it. Mia backed out, slamming the door shut and sprinting down the hallway. Her walkie-talkie crackled to life, a distorted voice whispering, "Why are you here?" The voice wasn't one of her colleagues. It was cold, rasping, and too close. You don't belong." She fumbled with the device, stammering, "Who is this? Hello?" But the only reply was faint laughter, echoing as though it came from all around her. Her rounds forgotten, Mia made a beeline for the security office, desperate for the safety of the monitors and reinforced walls. She burst through the door, locking it behind her, and scanned the cameras. The screens flickered and distorted, static obscuring much of the footage. But on one feed, a hallway she had just left, she saw it. A figure stood in the center of the frame, its body gaunt and unnaturally contorted. It wore what looked like a patient's gown, stained with something dark. Its head jerked unnaturally toward the camera, and though its face was featureless, Mia felt its gaze pierce her. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at the lens, at her. The lights in the security office went out. Panic consumed her as she groped for the flashlight, clicking it on just as the room was bathed in an unnatural cold. The static of the walkie-talkie grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping, whispering her name, beckoning her to come back. The doorknob rattled violently, and then the banging began. Slow at first, then faster, more insistent. Mia backed into the corner, clutching the flashlight as the door buckled under the force. Suddenly, the banging stopped. The silence was worse. She held her breath, staring at the door, waiting for the next move. A scraping sound came from behind her. She turned slowly, the flashlight trembling as she illuminated the wall. Written in jagged, bloody letters were the words, "Leave while you can." The air grew colder, and Mia's breath fogged the beam of light. Her walkie-talkie sputtered to life one last time. "We're waiting," the voice hissed. She didn't wait to see what was coming. She ran, the asylum's halls twisting and narrowing as if the building itself was trying to trap her. The exit seemed impossibly far, the sound of footsteps chasing her down every corridor. When she finally burst into the snow-covered night, she didn't stop running until she reached her car. The asylum loomed behind her, its broken windows like empty eyes watching her leave. But as she fumbled with her keys and glanced in the rearview mirror, her blood ran cold. In the back seat, barely visible in the dark, was the wheelchair, and it wasn't empty. The gas station sat on a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by miles of barren desert. Liz had been driving for hours, the night sky a void above her, the radio static her only company. Her fuel gauge hovered near empty, so she was relieved when the flickering neon sign for the station appeared on the horizon. She pulled into the lot, the tires crunching on the gravel, and stepped out into the stillness. The air was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made her skin crawl. The station looked abandoned, its windows dark, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. But the pump was working, and she needed gas. As she filled her tank, Liz kept glancing toward the small convenience store. Something about it felt off, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Then she saw the figure. At first, it was just a shadow, barely perceptible in the store's glass door. But as she stared, it became clearer. A man standing motionless in the doorway, his face obscured by the gloom. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge her presence. Liz's stomach twisted. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, maybe a mannequin or a trick of the light. Her tank was nearly full, and she just wanted to leave. But as she replaced the nozzle, the store's door creaked open, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. The man stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. He was tall, his clothes ragged and ill-fitting, his head tilted slightly as if trying to get a better look at her. "Need something?" he called, his voice low and gravelly. "No, I'm good, just getting gas," Liz replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't respond, just stared. His eyes glinted unnaturally in the dim light, and Liz felt the unmistakable sensation of being hunted. She slid back into her car, locking the doors with shaking hands, and started the engine. The man didn't move as she pulled away, his gaze following her as she drove back onto the highway. The relief was short-lived. In her rearview mirror, Liz saw headlights behind her. At first, she thought it was another traveler, but the lights were too close, their glare bright and aggressive. She pressed on the gas, her car speeding down the desolate road. The headlights stayed with her, matching her every move. Panic set in. She tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence, but her gut told her otherwise. When she glanced back, the car was gone, the highway behind her pitch black. Liz exhaled, her hands shaking on the wheel, and turned her attention back to the road. That's when she saw it. The man from the gas station stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by her headlights. She screamed, slamming on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded, the tires screeching, and came to a halt. The man was gone. No body, no sign he had ever been there. Her heart pounded as she sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring into the empty road ahead. She didn't dare get out. Slowly, she put the car in gear and began to drive again, her eyes darting to the mirrors, expecting to see him. And then she heard it. A faint scraping sound from above. It grew louder, more frantic, like nails clawing against metal. Liz's blood ran cold as she realized it was coming from the roof of her car. She pressed harder on the accelerator, the car roaring down the highway, but the noise didn't stop. It followed her, growing more violent, until it suddenly ceased. She didn't stop until she reached the next town, pulling into a brightly lit diner parking lot. Gasping for air, Liz stumbled out of the car, desperate to find someone, anyone. The few patrons inside stared at her disheveled appearance, but she didn't care. She ran to the counter, explaining what had happened to the bewildered waitress. "Calm down," the waitress said, placing a hand on Liz's arm. "You're safe now." But Liz wasn't convinced. She glanced out the diner window at her car, parked under a streetlight. The roof was dented, the paint scratched as if something or someone had been clinging to it. And written in the dust on her back window were the words, "Found you." It was Halloween night, and the storm outside rattled the old farmhouse where Kara was dog-sitting for the weekend. The house sat on the edge of a dense forest, isolated from the nearest neighbor by several miles of winding dirt roads. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving her to rely on the flickering glow of candles and the faint light of her phone. The dog, a massive German shepherd named Max, had been restless all evening. He paced the house, ears perked and hackles raised, occasionally growling at nothing Kara could see. She told herself it was just the storm unsettling him, but her nerves were starting to fray. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sounded like something more sinister. As the night dragged on, the unease grew unbearable. Kara decided to check the locks one more time, hoping the routine would calm her. She moved through the house, Max following closely, his low growl rumbling every few seconds. The doors and windows were secure, but when she passed the living room, she froze. The back door was wide open. The wind howled through the opening, blowing rain into the house. Kara's pulse thundered in her ears. She was certain she'd locked it earlier. She grabbed a flashlight and approached the door cautiously, Max at her side. Shining the beam outside, she saw only the rain-soaked yard and the edge of the forest beyond. No footprints, no sign of anyone. She slammed the door shut, locking it again, and turned to Max. "You've got to protect me, okay, buddy?" she whispered, but Max wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the staircase, his growl deepening. Kara followed his gaze, her blood running cold. At the top of the stairs, just visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was unnaturally tall, its long arms hanging at its sides, its face obscured by shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. "Who's there?" Kara's voice cracked as she called out, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if curious, and then it stepped back into the darkness, disappearing from view. Max bolted up the stairs, barking ferociously, but Kara stayed rooted in place, paralyzed with fear. She heard his paws scuffle on the wooden floor above, then silence. "Max?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave, she crept up the stairs, the flashlight trembling in her grip. The hallway was empty. The doors to the bedroom stood ajar, shadows pooling in the corners. "Max?" she whispered again, inching forward. A sound came from the last room on the left, a soft, wet, squelching noise. Kara's stomach turned. She pushed the door open slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Max lay in the center of the room, motionless, his fur matted with something dark. Kara stifled a scream, her free hand flying to her mouth. Above him, scrawled across the wall in what she could only hope wasn't blood, were the words, "Shh, not the dog, you." Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but the room was empty. The writing on the wall had vanished, replaced by peeling wallpaper. Max was gone too, no trace of him on the floor. The only sound was her own ragged breathing until she heard it again, that soft, wet squelching. It was coming from inside the closet. Kara backed away, her flashlight trembling as the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. And then something stepped out. It wasn't the figure she'd seen before. It was worse. Its face was a distorted mask of jagged teeth and hollow eyes, its limbs unnaturally long and jointed wrong. It smiled at her, if the grotesque stretch of its mouth could be called a smile, and spoke in a voice that sounded like broken glass. "You should have left." The flashlight flickered and went out. Kara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm outside. When the neighbors found the house the next morning, the doors were locked and the place was silent. The only sign that Kara had ever been there was a single word scratched into the wooden floorboards of the bedroom: "Run." It was late October, and Erin had just moved into her new apartment in an old brick building downtown. The rent was cheap, the space was cozy, and though the neighbors were few, she didn't mind the quiet. What did bother her was the closet. The apartment had only one, tucked into the corner of her bedroom, with a door that never seemed to close properly. She'd pushed it shut countless times, only to find it ajar the next morning, revealing the darkness within. She chalked it up to uneven floors, something common in old buildings. But as the nights passed, the closet door began to feel like a presence rather than a nuisance. One evening, after a long day at work, Erin was in bed scrolling on her phone. She glanced up to see the closet door slowly creak open, as if nudged by an invisible hand. The room was still, no draft or vibration to explain it. With a sigh of frustration, she got up and pushed it closed again, wedging a chair under the knob to keep it shut. Satisfied, she returned to bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard a faint sound, like soft breathing, coming from inside the closet. She told herself it was her imagination. Hours later, Erin woke abruptly to a sharp noise. A loud thud from the corner of the room. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw that the chair she'd wedged under the closet door had been knocked over. The door was wide open again, the darkness inside deeper than the shadows of the room. Her breath caught as she stared, waiting for her eyes to adjust. For a moment, nothing happened, and then she saw it, something moving inside the closet. It was subtle at first, a shifting in the shadows, but then it became unmistakable. A hand, pale and bony, reached out from the blackness, gripping the doorframe. Erin froze, unable to scream. The hand was followed by an arm, unnaturally long and thin, its joints bending backward. A head emerged next, its face stretched and wrong, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The thing crawled forward, its limbs cracking as it moved. It stopped at the edge of the closet, tilting its head at her like a predator assessing its prey. Erin scrambled backward on the bed, finally finding her voice to scream. The thing let out a low, guttural noise, its mouth stretching into a toothy grin. She bolted for the door, but it was faster. It lunged across the room, slamming the bedroom door shut before she could reach it. Erin spun around, pressing her back against the door, her chest heaving. The creature stood in the center of the room, its twisted form silhouetted by the faint moonlight. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Desperate, Erin grabbed the lamp from her bedside table and hurled it at the thing. The lamp shattered against the wall, and the creature laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that made her skin crawl. It began to crawl toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. In a panic, Erin flung open the door and ran into the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. She didn't stop until she was out of the building and standing in the middle of the street, gasping for air. The apartment remained dark and silent behind her, but she could feel its gaze, the thing watching her from the bedroom window. She didn't go back inside. When she returned the next day with a friend to gather her things, the closet was gone. In its place was a solid, unbroken wall, as if it had never existed. But every night since, no matter where she sleeps, Erin hears the sound of a closet door creaking open and a soft voice whispering, "You can't leave." The storm had rolled in unexpectedly, drenching the isolated campground where Daniel and his friends had been camping for the weekend. By nightfall, the rain had turned their plans into a muddy mess, and the group decided to cut their trip short. But Daniel, ever the adventurous one, opted to stay behind. "I'll pack up in the morning," he had said with a grin. "One last night under the stars." His friends reluctantly left, their taillights disappearing down the dirt road, leaving him alone with the flickering light of his campfire. The forest around him was dense and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. As the hours passed, the storm grew fiercer, and the wind howled through the trees. Daniel wrapped himself in his sleeping bag, his flashlight close at hand. He told himself the sounds outside were just animals sheltering from the storm. But when the noises began, soft, deliberate footsteps crunching through the wet leaves, he knew this was something else. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. There was no answer, only the sound of the rain and wind. But the footsteps continued, circling his campsite, moving closer. He grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam caught only the trunks of trees and the heavy rain. And then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. At first it looked like a person, but the longer he stared, the more wrong it seemed. It was too tall, its limbs too long, and its face was shrouded in shadow, but the outline of its head seemed distorted as though it were wearing a mask. "Who's there?" Daniel yelled, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Then, as if the storm itself had grown still, the wind died and the rain seemed to quiet. Daniel's heart thundered in his chest as the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Daniel backed away, nearly tripping over the fire pit. The figure stopped, tilting its head to the side as if studying him. It raised one long arm and pointed directly at him. Daniel didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted toward the tent, scrambling to grab his car keys and his phone. He could hear the footsteps behind him, faster now, matching his frantic movements. He burst out of the tent, sprinting toward his car parked at the edge of the clearing. Rain lashed at his face as he fumbled with the keys, finally yanking the door open and throwing himself inside. He locked the doors and turned on the headlights, illuminating the forest ahead. Nothing. Nothing. His breathing was ragged as he started the engine, the sound drowning out the rain. But as he looked into the rearview mirror, his blood turned to ice. The figure was there, standing just behind the car, its face now visible, a blank, featureless expanse of pale, wet skin. Daniel slammed on the gas, the tires spinning in the mud before catching and propelling the car forward. He didn't stop until he reached the main road, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. He drove straight home, refusing to look into the mirror again. By the time he reached his driveway, the storm had passed and the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. He staggered into his house, locking every door and window before collapsing onto the couch. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep eluded him. Every creak of the house made his pulse. Finally, exhaustion claimed him, and he drifted off, the events of the night fading into uneasy dreams. But when he woke in the morning, he found something chilling. His muddy boots were sitting by the front door, exactly where he had left them. But beside them was another set of prints, larger and wetter, leading from the door to the edge of his bed. And carved into the wood of his bedside table were the words, "I found you." The town of Black Hollow was known for its legends, but none more infamous than the story of the Reflection Man. It was said that on certain nights, if you stared into a mirror for too long, he would appear, not behind you, but inside the mirror, watching, waiting. Maggie had heard the stories growing up. Tales passed around schoolyards and whispered at slumber parties. She never believed them, chalking it up to small-town superstition. But now, living alone in her grandmother's old house, the legend felt a little too close for comfort. The house was filled with mirrors, antique, tarnished glass that seemed to peer back at her no matter where she went. She'd meant to take them down, but never got around to it. One chilly autumn night, as the wind howled outside and the creaks of the house grew louder, Maggie stood brushing her teeth in the upstairs bathroom. The mirror above the sink was cracked in one corner, giving it a warped, eerie quality. She avoided looking directly into it as much as possible, but tonight her curiosity got the better of her. For a moment, nothing seemed amiss. Her reflection stared back at her, tired but normal. She leaned closer, wiping a smudge off the glass, and froze. Her reflection hadn't moved. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, but her reflection remained rooted, staring straight ahead, unblinking. Its eyes seemed darker than hers, deeper, like twin voids threatening to pull her in. "Stop it," Maggie whispered to herself, gripping the edge of the sink. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to breathe. When she opened them again, the reflection was normal. It blinked, moved as she did, a perfect mimic. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Just tired," she muttered, turning off the light and heading to bed. But sleep wouldn't come. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks. But when she glanced toward the corner of her bedroom, her blood ran cold. The mirror there, covered by a sheet she'd thrown over it months ago, seemed to shift, the fabric rippling as if something were moving behind it. She sat up, her pulse racing, and watched as the sheet slid to the floor. The glass was black, reflecting nothing, but she couldn't look away. Then, slowly, a figure began to take shape in the mirror. It wasn't her. The outline was taller, thinner, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to stretch too far in every direction. Its eyes were sunken pits, its mouth an impossibly wide grin. "Maggie," it said, the sound more like a sigh than a voice. She screamed, bolting from the bed, but the figure didn't move. It simply watched as she scrambled out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She grabbed her phone and called her best friend, Emily, who lived just a few streets away. "You have to come," Maggie gasped, barely able to speak. "The mirrors? There's something in them." Emily didn't hesitate, promising to be there in minutes. Maggie paced the living room, every reflective surface covered with whatever she could find, blankets, towels, even an old coat. She refused to look into any of them. When Emily arrived, Maggie flung open the door, relief washing over her at the sight of her friend. "Thank God you're here," she said, pulling her inside. But Emily's face was blank, her movements stiff. "You shouldn't have looked," she said in a flat, hollow voice. Maggie stepped back, her heart racing. "Emily?" she whispered, but her friend only smiled, an expression too wide, too wrong, stretching across her face like a mask. And then Maggie saw it, just behind Emily in the hallway mirror. The reflection man. He was no longer inside the glass. He was standing there, his head tilted, grinning with teeth too sharp and too many. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, both Emily and the figure were gone. The house was silent once more, except for a faint, distant laugh echoing from the mirrors. Maggie never slept in that house again, but no matter where she went, every mirror she passed seemed to hold a shadow just out of sight. And every so often she would hear her name, whispered softly from the depths of the glass. "Maggie!" The legend of the midnight caller was one everyone in the small town had heard. It was said that if your phone rang after midnight and you answered, you'd hear nothing but static until a voice spoke your name. The voice would sound like someone you knew, someone you trusted, but it wasn't them. And once you heard it, it would find you, no matter where you went. Sophia didn't believe in urban legends. She laughed when her coworkers at the diner swapped ghost stories, dismissing them as nonsense. But she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as she drove home that night. The roads were empty, and the dark country landscape seemed to stretch endlessly. Her house, an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, loomed ahead like a shadow against the night sky. She parked her car, locked the doors, and stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen. As the clock struck midnight, her phone buzzed. Sophia frowned, pulling it from her pocket. The screen displayed unknown number. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of her. She swiped to answer. "Hello?" she said. There was silence, then static, soft at first, then louder, crackling in her ear. She pulled the phone away, about to hang up, when she heard it. A faint voice, distorted but unmistakable. "Sophia?" Her heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. The static grew louder, drowning out the voice, and then the line went dead. She stared at the phone, her hand trembling slightly. It had to be a prank, she told herself, someone from work messing with her. She set the phone down and turned off the lights, climbing into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. She kept thinking about the call, about the way the voice had said her name. It had sounded almost familiar. At some point, she must have drifted off because she woke to the sound of her phone buzzing again. Her heart sank as she glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. The screen glowed with the same unknown number. Her hand hovered over the phone. She didn't want to answer, but a strange compulsion urged her to. She swiped the screen. Hello? This time there was no static, just silence. And then, I'm outside. The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they chilled her to the bone. She jumped out of bed, her eyes darting to the window. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. She grabbed a kitchen knife and checked every door and window, making sure they were locked. Satisfied that no one could get in, she returned to her room, heart still pounding. The phone buzzed again. She didn't want to answer, but her hand moved as if on its own. What do you want? She snapped, her voice shaking. This time the voice was louder, clearer. Let me in, Sophia. Her blood ran cold. The voice was no longer distorted. It sounded like her mother's, soft and pleading. But her mother had been dead for 3 years. Sophia threw the phone across the room, the screen shattering as it hit the wall. The house was silent again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She turned to the window. Her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood outside, just beyond the glass, its face obscured by the darkness. It was tall, its frame unnaturally thin, and its hands were pressed against the window pane. Sophia, it said, its voice muffled but unmistakable. It wasn't her mother anymore. It wasn't anyone she knew. She backed away, the knife trembling in her grip. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt suffocating, like it was pressing into the house, into her mind. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, the figure was gone. But the phone rang again, its screen lighting up with 2 words, "Behind you." Sophia turned, the scream caught in her throat as the world went dark. The next morning, her coworkers noticed she hadn't shown up for her shift. When the police entered her house, they found her phone lying on the bed, the screen still glowing. The last call had been logged at 3 a.m. The number? Unknown.